Obviously, it's a very, very, very bad situation, and Dreamland is responding to it on two different levels. First, we're going to go way out on the edge with Scott Stevens of weatherwars.info, and throughout the program, I say weatherwars.org. It's not weatherwars.org. The correct is weatherwars.info. You'll want to look at his website as you listen, I'm sure. His thesis is that there is a war going on and that the weather is the weapon. Not only that we are behind, the United States is well behind whoever is attacking us with the weather and with earthquakes. And as I speak, there have been a cluster of 4-point-plus earthquakes in Southern California, which is very unusual and suggests that there may indeed be another earthquake here. You'll be interested to see how he reacts to that. Dreamland also, as you know, we have a subscriber end of it, and in the subscriber section this week, I'm talking about what, in my opinion, is probably one of the most important things I've ever done. It's a conversation or a discussion about group meditation and the power of group meditation, how it works, what it is, and how to do it, because we need to start doing that. We can make a lot of change with this. It's not any kind of pie in the sky. It does work, and let me tell you how. So do subscribe. We have had in the past week a tremendous drop-off in subscriptions for this website because people are riveted to their televisions by what's happening to Hurricane Katrina. However, the truth is, this is probably one of the most relevant and important places, this website and unknowncountry.com. If you follow the news on unknowncountry.com and you take our free newsletter, you are getting news that is literally not available anywhere else. For example, we talk about coming gas shortages in the Southeast and Midwest and how to prepare for them. You don't hear that anywhere. We talk about, is the situation in New Orleans even much worse than we're being told in the United States? Because you may not know this, but foreign media sources are showing horrendous images of floating corpses being eaten by alligators in that city. Apparently it is maybe even worse than they're saying. And here in this country, just as if after 9/11, our media did not show people jumping out of the World Trade Center in droves, which they did do. So we are being maybe kind of, the truth is being held back. They're saying abroad, New Orleans may be a dead city, and that may be true. Now listen, Scott talks about whether or not this is something that was done. Now, do I believe this? My job on Dreamland is not to endorse my guests at all, but rather to let them talk in ways that they really can't talk on other radio programs, because everybody else goes in with some kind of an agenda, some sort of agenda. I have no agenda. My agenda is I want him to tell you what he thinks. And that's exactly what I do, and you'll find this interview, quite frankly, I'm sure, just like I found it, absolutely riveting. Then after that, we're going to go to a professor of geology from St. Louis University. We're going to spend 2 segments with him. This is a man who predicted this happening 3 years, in 2003. He predicted it. He is a very, very well-established geologist, and he lays it out more clearly than you have ever heard anywhere else, what did happen, what must be done, and what the consequences might be, what we can look at down the road for this. So this is Dreamland at its, in my opinion, absolute best. I was absolutely glued to my chair by both of these guys. So before we go on, I'm just going to ask you to stop and think a minute about where this comes from. It comes out of your pocket. You have to pay for it. Subscribe, because we are running scared here now. We need you, and I've added a little inducement. If you subscribe for a year now, the first 25 people who do so between now and Sunday midnight get a free copy of the 911 in Plain Sight Director's Cut DVD. It's the best offer I've ever had on this radio program, because basically if we don't get the cash, we got to cut back, and this is not the time for that. No sirree, Bob. So do yourself something you've been needing to do for a while. Right now, while you're listening, click on that subscribe tab on the unknowncountry.com website. You can see it just to the right of the media player. Click on it now while you listen. And if you already are a subscriber, thank you, thank you, thank you. We are alive because of you, and we are almost alone in this world in reporting the news as we do in ways you simply cannot get it elsewhere. We have with us Scott Stevens of weatherwars.info. Weatherwars.info is a website devoted to a very unusual aspect of weather observation. Scott is involved in the weather modification issue, and we're going to begin by asking, if I may, Scott, how you became involved in this, and what exactly are your credentials for being an expert on weather modification and weather wars?
Yeah. Weather has been an interest of mine for quite some time. Between astronomy and weather, it was kind of a debate as I went through junior high and high school as to which path I would eventually take. I really wanted to be an astronaut, but then that was growing up during the Apollo days when we did exciting things in space. But I ended up in weather partially because of the Scouting Merit Badge, and that interest introduced me to the topic, and I just found it fascinating. I enjoyed the numbers, I enjoyed the observations, and so forth. So that kind of led me on this path to, and the first job I took was a senior in high school, working at a local TV station here in Idaho. And from then, off to the University of Kansas to study meteorology, and then working at several affiliates across the country, from Topeka to Omaha to Albany, New York, Tulsa, and then eventually out here to Idaho. What got me interested in this topic was the inability to get more accurate forecasts as the computer models and as our experience would have deemed or we would have seen necessary. We would have gotten better as time went on. But as I kind of would go back through and do verification of forecasts, the accuracy slipped from, say, at 5 days out, 4 degrees or 3 degrees error to about 4 degrees. And I'm like, well, what am I doing wrong? What am I missing that I can't get these forecasts correct? And that led to this area of manipulation and the research of a Lieutenant Colonel Tom Bearden and his essays and his intelligence going back to a Soviet weapons program titled Energetics that was developed by Stalin and had incredible resources devoted to it. And in fact, while we were developing the atomic bomb with the Manhattan Project, Stalin matched us bomb for bomb, as we all know. But he also commandeered his best scientists and said, get me a secret weapon. Get me something that these Americans don't have. And they brought boatloads of documents from universities and from science and from publications and scoured them, not in a peer review process where you pat each other on the back for work done, but to tear them to pieces, looking for errors, looking for bad assumptions, and so forth. And they found them. They found them in the laws of thermodynamics. They found them in the laws of conservation of energy. They found them in basically classical physics and relativity. And they fixed them. And this mates quantum physics with classical physics with a unified theory. And it is from this in physics that they developed their energetics program, which resulted in a new kind of electromagnetic wave. Not the Hertzian waves that we send along, telephone signals and television signals and so forth, but longitudinal waves, which is far more like sound. And then use of these waves can affect a target at great distance, like you're just sitting next to it. So you could melt metal, you could shoot down planes, you could crush subs, you could do amazing things without ever having to fire a bullet. And one of the aspects of this technology was the ability to turn back the gain on these antennas and influence the weather, influence the electrical processes, which are still not acknowledged within the scientific or the atmospheric sciences. I mean, they really don't understand how lightning works. Well, this gives us the answers as to how the atmosphere works, and that the electrical process is a massive portion of the equation that our guys still don't get. And in this way, they can covertly use weather as a weapon.
What about earthquakes?
Easy to do. Easy to do.
Okay, now let me stop you right there, okay?
Sure.
Because something is happening right now as we are talking. We are talking a little bit before the program goes online. It is the 1st of September. It is approximately 11:10 Pacific time, and in the past few hours, over the 31st of August and the 1st of September, there have been 7 earthquakes in Southern California with a magnitude of 4 or greater. And I'm asking you now, could this, and we're going to get into Katrina in a minute, this is something that is being done by somebody. Could it be that their next step is a big Southern California earthquake, Scott?
That's my full expectation, is that we'll have 2 events, 2 cities will have some level of damage that will tie them together temporally, time-wise, because of Katrina, 29, 30 August, and then whatever is next to happen. There's an interesting website that I subscribe to. It's called halfpasthuman.com, and they send bots out to scour the web, and their technology is ALTA, Asymmetric Language Trend Analysis, and they basically distill all of the communications that happen across the web over a set period of time, and they foresaw frighteningly accurately the issue that New Orleans is facing now, essentially a city sinking in the mud, and then upwards of 2 million refugees wandering away from these cities by foot.
Okay, now tell us that website. Can you give us that?
Half Past Human.
Okay, spell that out, will you?
HALFPASTHUMAN. And it's only available by subscription. But they see another event very, very close in time to Katrina that is earthquake-based. And their accuracy has been so good that you almost have to expect that. Whereas here in the West, we have really avoided much of the energy disruption that the folks in the Gulf Coast are experiencing or will soon experience. And an event out here in the West would put the Southern California refineries and import-export pipelines and so forth, again, at great risk. And so then you see these 2 shocks happening, and then who knows the eventual reverberations as they work across the economy. But these are covert actions, and you could only pull this off with secret weapons.
Boy, they're not fooling around with their subscription costs. It's $150 a month.
That's right. And if you're in ahead of time, as I am, it runs about $70 a run. And
what do you get for that?
It's been worth it. It's been worth it because there are things that they see coming, especially economically, and a move from unity and cohesion into one of militarization. And they pegged that beginning at August 17th and then running through about the 10th of September. And indeed, that is unfolding presently. So we have amazing times coming up ahead of us that will challenge us all in ways that we didn't know we could be challenged or would be challenged. Whether it's additional storms coming into the West Coast, or if it's just dealing personally with the after effects of these storms, we all have immense challenges immediately ahead of us that are going to take preparation, emotional, spiritual, and physical. And those need to be, as the Hurricane Center is prompt of saying, rushed to completion. So, it's where do you go? I mean, the technology dealing with this weather was deployed against the world the July 4th weekend, 1976, and we have not had natural weather since that point in time.
Now, so how do you know what exactly was done, and how do you know it was done?
That was the woodpecker grid. If you listen to shortwave radio to a multitude of frequencies that range from right about 3 megahertz to upwards of 30 megahertz, you can hear this constant thumping, just thump, 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 and
I've heard
there are numerous. You've heard it.
Oh yeah.
And that was the initiation of this program, and there was a great uproar to get the Soviets to stop this, but it hasn't stopped. The only thing they've done is add a spread spectrum technique to where the frequencies gradually drift, so they haven't simply overwhelmed one specific frequency for all time. it does drift from time to time, and again across numerous frequencies where they develop and pump into the Earth standing waves. So you get this resonance, this reservoir of energy that just is constantly bouncing around through the center of this planet. And then as you focus these antennas, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 antennas at a time over a certain distance, by adding or subtracting energy, you'll get the desired results. Whether that's quakes, whether that's volcanism, whether that's an alteration in the weather, whether that's a warming of the crust or the oceans, all of these things are possible. And it's a fantastic weapon, as a Khrushchev so boasted on the cover of New York Times in 1960. It was a fantastic weapon that they saw reducing the need for conventional weapons, for man on the ground. They would be able to do these things remotely. And indeed, it's underway. It's been underway for quite some time. It's just been a war that has not been in the public's eye.
A war that we might be the victims of right now, Scott. Scott, let me just rush on for a second to ask you a question about a bill which I suspect you're probably familiar with, the Weather Modification Operations and Research Bill that was introduced into the United States Senate by Kay Bailey Hutchinson in March. Are you familiar with that bill?
I have had that bill emailed more times to me than just about any version of spam. They're trying to bring this gradually out into the public's consciousness. It's a deliberate disclosure. And that's why I've not run into any resistance in discussing these things in the open. It's simply time. It's time people knew. They didn't think they could keep this project a secret for as long as they have.
Yes.
And yet this is just the beginning. This is the cusp. And when we begin
because
to
this bill, actually what it does is it simply legalizes chemtrails.
True. Now, the
Among
reason for chemtrails is my research into the chemtrail is a little different angle than those by others in the field.
And we're going to find out more about that in just a minute from Scott.
Okay.
This is really wild. We'll be right back. This is Whitley Strieber. It's Dreamland. This is Whitley Strieber. It's Dreamland. We're back talking with Scott Stevens about weather modification. And, Scott, before we left the air, you were talking about the fact that you approached this from the whole chemtrails thing from a little bit of a different viewpoint. Could you tell us exactly where you're coming from?
When I became aware of the scalar weaponry that was happening in the skies, I couldn't approach that topic without having to address the chemtrails in some form or fashion. And when I first published the site last October, I had a portion on chemtrails and showing the pictures that I had taken of them and watching the dispersion of the clouds, of the developing clouds that they're there to seed. And it could have been climate, it could have been ozone protection, it could have been numerous things. But it wasn't until I set up time-lapse cameras around the house, and I have 4 of them running from before sunup to after sundown. And it began to watch the behavior of how and where these planes flew. That there seemed to be specific locations that would attract a fleet of planes in a very short amount of time. And these planes all displayed contrails of varying lengths. Sometimes the contrails were long, sometimes they were medium to short, and sometimes they were just tiny little guys, but they would all show up literally within minutes of each other as they would fly in and around this particular point in the atmosphere. And then seeing that happen over and over and over again, I got to thinking that there's something happening. There's something there. They're not just creating clouds. It was too general of an assumption. And then I started taking broadcast quality video of these planes and noticed that in the skies, in and around these cirrus clouds, that there was an unusual imprint. And these planes would fly directly through these scalar imprints that would create high clouds. And then in the time-lapse, it was very, very apparent that they were boxing in. They were defining the limits of these scalar imprints within the atmosphere. Now, this technology has essentially overlaid a grid, a matrix, across the entire planet's atmosphere, to where these numerous antennas, probably numbering in the thousands, will heat and cool particular zones or cubes of the sky. And what happens when you heat a parcel of atmosphere or air? It expands and thereby exerts pressure on the nearby parcels of the atmosphere. And if you set up these antennas to pulse or to warm, vast areas of these blocks or these cubes, you can entrain or trap the movement of the jet stream. And you cool them on one side and heat them on the other, and you accelerate the jet stream. Now, we built massive magnets in the mid-'70s just outside of Chicago and shipped them to Russia. In 1977, one of our best Cray supercomputers was packed up and shipped to Russia. Much to the chagrin of Congress, they were not happy about this, but this happened at a very, very high level. But the planes are simply there painting the skies to make these electromagnetic signatures visible, to make what is invisible visible. So we can remote sense from satellite, look at these contrails, how they are misformed, how they are pushed to one side, or how they'll display helical twisting, as you'll see one layer of the atmosphere literally sheared against another at 90 degrees. And from watching these cameras and watching the time-lapse movement of clouds, I have seen cumulus clouds pop up and then just dance over the city or hold still, while other clouds will move through them. Just simply one cloud moves through the other as one weather machine is turned up at a higher intensity than someone else's to try to get the desired effect. And you'll notice this in the satellite imagery, where you'll get just a checkerboard effect to the clouds. And the cloud height is cut short so you don't get the raindroplet formation. And then at least out here in the west, the drought goes on. But they need these planes constantly surveying the sky, looking for this electromagnetic effect in the atmosphere. And then that data is dumped into the short-term forecast models for the military, not for the public. And then they run out and begin to see what the eventual goal of the other side is by their constant EM interference in the atmosphere. It's an amazingly complex program. And it went on for years before we got a clue. And with the contrails being initiated probably at the soonest values or soonest times in the mid to late 80s, when our government was first briefed by this Colonel Bearden's staff of this electromagnetic war we were fighting. And there are so many examples that pilots flying the Great Circle route from the western U.S. to Alaska, across, and then being able to look into far eastern Siberia before they dropped into Seoul or into Tokyo. And these pilots would see glowing domes, 200-300 miles inside and 5-10 miles in height, glowing domes. They would see cold explosions that would just erupt from the top of the ocean, and these mushroom clouds would reach, vaulting to 60,000 feet in under 3 minutes. And when this intelligence would come back into the CIA, they didn't know where to classify. They didn't know what this meant because they weren't familiar with the technology. And this was the Soviets continuing to develop and do research. They have vast tracts of land where there just are very few people with little communication, so they could keep it largely secret. And they had nuclear power plants powering these weapons. But it's an incredibly complex program, and we are behind the curve. We're behind the curve. We were at least 30 years in trying to catch up, first of all, with the math, with the physics, with the understanding of the technology, before we began to deploy our countermeasures. So it's gone on for a lot longer than people would like to accept.
Now, let's get back to Hurricane Katrina.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that anything about this hurricane suggests modification? Somebody was there?
Knowing what I know about the completeness of this plan, the completeness of the technology, the name was chosen ahead of time, as was Ivan's name. The lists of these storms are published years ahead of time. And there was a plan to allow Katrina to spin her up to do exactly what she did. There's simply a playbook in operation.
Now, when you say lists are published years ahead of time, that's true. The names are. Why is the name Katrina significant?
Because it's Russian, as was Ivan, and following a strikingly similar path. This was a demonstration illustrating what they're capable of. They're simply capable of spinning up a storm, driving Katrina's eye on top of this nation's hurricane research center, this nation's hurricane forecast center, the Tropical Prediction Center in Coral Gables, Florida. The eye of this storm last Thursday went over the top of that facility.
That's correct. It did.
It did.
Yeah.
And that was a wake-up call, and basically a message that you guys don't know what's coming. And then
in other words, you're saying that the Russians are ahead of us in weather modification technology, and they are firing hurricanes at us like shells out of a cannon?
Like dodgeballs. Yep, you betcha. And we're scrambling to catch up. Now there is the possibility that this technology is run by an elite group that is yet above all governments. That is a possibility I have to acknowledge.
Well, what if there's another possibility that it's run by terrorists, or in the case of the Russians, Vladimir Putin is a very unbalanced guy. He does not play with anything approaching a full deck at all. And it could be that he sees the United States' success economically on a global scale as contrasted to Russia's failure and decline as a real threat. And it could be that he intends to take this country down a peg. I would think that would be a very real motive in that man's mind if he had the means to do so. And you're saying that he has the means to do so. Could you give us any indication of just what about Katrina suggests to you that it may have been the product of weather modification?
He's the former director of the KGB. This technology was only within the KGB's handling. I mean, it did not get out to the typical and the mainstream Russian military. This was kept secret. This was kept very close at hand. So as that man left the operations of the KGB and then moved into the federal government, he was capable of still using those ties, using that knowledge for the benefit of Russia. And we engineered economically the collapse of the former Soviet Union in the middle 80s with the crash of the price of oil, other natural resources, and with gold. That happened in the middle to late 80s. And when they went cash poor, this weaponry essentially went up for lease to those who could afford it. And what we find as far as signatures as to anomalies, squares, lots and lots of squares that should not happen in a fluid, which is how the atmosphere is modeled, is in a fluid. We find right angles. We find shapes in the form of ladders. We find symmetry, where you have a towering thunderhead up. A short distance away, there'll be a hole in the cloud where the energy is simply extracted from one area and then used to enhance storm development in another. So it's not necessarily a closed system, a closed energy system, but what is there can be shuffled around to achieve an end. And we saw the eye of Katrina do an amazing wobble as it appeared to be making a direct path for New Orleans. The eye wall elongated, like there was two centers forming. And
we got to take a little break right now.
Okay.
We're going to get into the details of just what was wrong with this hurricane and why it did not look entirely like a natural object. Just a couple of minutes. We'll be right back. This is Whitley Strieberry at Streamline. We're back. We're talking to Scott Stevens of weatherwars.org. We are talking about Hurricane Katrina. Now, was this a natural storm, or was there anything about it that suggests to this expert on weather modification that it may have been modified? We were just getting ready to talk about that, a couple of things. Why don't you we get right back into it, Scott?
What we're talking about is just the unusual geometry that seem to present itself in and around the eye and through many of the feeder bands. As this energy matrix, this grid is overlaid upon the Earth's weather, at the edges of these grids are obviously squares, L shapes, and many of the thunderstorm towers that begin to fire up are in the shapes of L's. Now, these shapes, these hard right angles, and the other geometry in the form of stars, squares, circles and squares, would not happen in a gas or a fluid. It's just simply unnatural. Now, you'll get some resonances, you'll get some gravity waves naturally forming from these storms. But these storms are just constantly littered with these pulses of this technology, resulting in these unusual shapes on the tops of the clouds. The symmetry is a really, really big one, where you'll have two clusters of thunderstorms that literally look identical. In the middle of them, there'll be holes. On the tops, there'll be little square hooks with high clouds streaming off, but then again, hooked at the end. Holes will appear where there is an anchoring of energy or a withdrawal of energy from the local space-time environment. That energy is then put somewhere else nearby to enhance the storm's development. It's kind of like taking a rubber band and sticking your finger at one anchoring end of the hole of the rubber band and then kind of walking it back and forth. So you get this straddling, this wobbling. And that happened with the eye of Katrina. As she was about to just blast New Orleans, there was one of those wobbles. They had already sufficiently pushed enough of a storm surge into Lake Pontchartrain to flood New Orleans. And then at this last minute, when all of New Orleans is hunkered down waiting for the storm to arrive, you hit Gulfport, you hit Biloxi, you hit these other portions of this Gulf Coast, which are not expecting to be as close to the eye wall. But indeed, with that last-minute jog,
and you're saying that the hurricane was literally maneuvered in order to cause the maximum possible amount of damage, because they knew by that time that the levees would be overrun by the water from Lake Pontchartrain. So it was time to move the hurricane and sock the rest of the Gulf Coast with it.
Exactly. Just as Charlie did when they were anticipating it last year to arrive in Tampa, but yet jogged inland immediately and hit Punta Gorda and those portions in around Port Charlotte, Florida. This happens all the time. And the meteorologists are really struggling to find a reason for these jogs. And in their discussions, they'll continually say, oh, how little we know about these storms. And that's their white flag going up, saying we have a lot to learn. And if they would look and understand the electrical processes of this atmosphere, they could begin to put the pieces of this puzzle together. And it is my firm belief that at the top levels of NOAA, of the NWS, they know this is happening. I mean, the guy that's leading the National Weather Service is a brigadier general. I mean, he's not a nerdy scientist, and he's not an administrator. He's a brigadier general. So that kind of lets us know
they know that someone is modifying the weather in ways that hurt us, is what you're saying, but not necessarily who or... I mean, I find it difficult to believe that the same CIA that gave us all of that wonderfully useful information about the collapse of the Soviet Union, which they missed, and then was equally helpful in Iraq, would know anything really clear about anything as sensitive as this. It would seem to me that maybe they don't know enough. Maybe that's the problem.
I think they know plenty. It's just that the information is compartmentalized. And those who would share with the public are not allowed to. And so as long as that information is held very, very close at hand, these agendas will continue to be played out. And there's no question in my mind, but there is a playbook, a plan for the year. And it's interesting that all the Fed governors met out in Jackson Hole last week, and dealing with the immediate, changes that will happen economically across this country as a result of this. We also have the Director of Homeland Security yesterday on CNN saying they have been prepared for this disaster for weeks. Well, how can you prepare for a disaster for weeks if the hurricane isn't 8 days old as it makes landfall? They know. They simply know these things ahead of time.
That's true. He did say that, and yet, at the same time, the administration has been continually dragging its feet with regard to doing necessary work on maintenance of those levees down in New Orleans, and even to the point of cutting the Army Corps of Engineers budget in the new budget and announcing that the plan to explore how to safeguard New Orleans from a Category 5 hurricane was shelved. So
they have a lot of questions that they're going to need to answer, and there will be a demand for accountability.
I mean, because what you're saying, Scott, is if it suggests that if weather modification is taking place, again, it's just like 911 when you had a situation where after the election, documents from the FAA were declassified showing that they had warned the administration 52 times of the possibility that those planes were going to hit the World Trade Center. And then Condoleezza Rice sat in the 9/11 Commission hearings and said, we were not expecting this, and she was on the National Security Council that received those 52 warnings. It seems to me they let that happen. Are you saying they let this happen too? But why?
The intelligence for 9/11 was so good that there were no Israeli nationals show up to work that day. 440 of them did not show up for work. The intelligence was that good with 9/11. Some people were notified to not show up for work, and everybody else that our government was responsible for was allowed to show up. They knew it was coming, and just like this storm, the parallels are going to be uncanny. They knew it was coming. What else can you say? I mean, the control over these natural earth processes are that good, and that's kind of what's disturbing, is that you have people praying to God, praying to salvage their city, to save themselves.
As we did on this radio program and in our newsletter just a few days ago, we were praying. And we ended up in a situation where now we're praying for deliverance from this suffering for all these people, because the worst happened.
We can't ask for deliverance. We have to ask for strength to get through. I mean, that's simply what it's going to become in the days ahead. I mean, because of who we elected and because we allow our government to act as they do, we will have to live with their actions. We all have that responsibility, and we all have that charge against us because we are Americans. We have.
Now, why because of who we elected? What's wrong with who we elected? Why is their presence making
because
this?
They don't have the highest and best good for all of us at their plan, at their desires. They have a different agenda for us than they have for themselves, and that's the disconnect. Is that our representative form of government is not representative of the people. It's representative of the elite. And there's a very big difference. We have a wonderful, wonderful country that has a very, very bad government. And it's time we had a third party. We need a third party. That has to begin, because 2008 is very close. And we need a third party that will stand up for we the people, will do and be honest with us about things that are happening to us. And it's just simply time for a third party. We need new and different leadership. One that New Orleans should have been evacuated. That order should have gone out on Saturday. They needed to get those people out of there. And if there truly was a playbook, then there could have been those resources available ahead of time to begin to draw these people out. And those that left, those that are now of refugee status, thought they were leaving for 48 hours and would come home. They have nothing but what's on their backs. And that's it's going to set up a very, very unstable situation, because we're talking about hundreds upon hundreds of thousands of people that will likely be permanently dislocated from their homes. It's going to take far more than a year to drain and prep New Orleans to be repaired. And
maybe it can't be repaired if it's too toxic.
That's my feeling.
I mean, it might be that the city's going to be turned out, that the mud that's left behind is so toxic that it's essentially the city is dead.
The city will be reclaimed by the lake.
It could very well happen.
Yep.
That we had we lost an American city here, and if you're right about this weather modification thing, then we're at war. And what you're saying is that essentially somebody on the outside and more or less our own leaders are on one side, and we the people are on the other, running around trying to buy canoes. What is the ultimate objective of all of this, though? The destruction of the United States as a coherent economy would bring about mass starvation and a world catastrophe from which civilization would not recover in the lifetime of anyone alive now.
That is the stated goal. You've put it very, very well.
To cause a dieback of the human species, to reduce the population. Is this what you're talking about? Or
It's begun. It's simply begun. And you won't get the press talking about it at that honest level, because they'll try to keep the status quo in place for as long as possible, rather than preparing the people for the incredible change to society which has begun. I mean, we will never go back to free and easy and cheap gas. We have bought homes that are worth a fraction of what we've paid for them, and we're in debt. A nation in debt is a nation without a lot of options.
Without a lot of options, we are horribly in debt, and we've got a combination of tax cuts and the Iraq War, which have put our country in a very vulnerable position financially. Now we have the gas crisis, which is causing a cash crunch among the ordinary people at a time when their mortgages in 2006 and 2007, people who bought in 2003, 4, and 5, are going to start rising because of the fact that their interest-only portions of their mortgages are ending. So we got a problem. I agree with you. And Scott, I would like to thank you for having been with us on Dreamland. And next week on Dreamland, we're going to be talking to Peter Levenda, his new book, Sinister Forces. Wow, what a book. Let me just give you a brief, tiny sample of what is going to be going on next week. Peter Levenda has discovered that the two of the federal agents who were involved in the very first UFO encounters in 1947 in the United States were also subpoenaed by Jim Garrison in 1968 in the Kennedy assassination. That's just for starters next week, so stay tuned with Dreamland, and thanks again, Scott. Scott's website, weatherwars.org. Don't miss it. Provocative, way out on the edge, and if it's true, boy, have we got a problem. Hurricane Katrina, of course, has been one of the worst catastrophes in the history of the United States or any other country. Our guest today predicted this devastation 2 years ago in his 2003 book, Geological Hazards. He's St. Louis University professor Timothy Kuski. He has warned about this, and unfortunately, Tim, it looks like the warnings were not heeded.
That's right. There are predictions. I'm not the only one who has been saying that New Orleans is one of the biggest natural disasters waiting to happen in this country, and it's been difficult to evaluate how much resources should be put in protecting the city against a potential catastrophe like this, and weighing what the odds are of it really happening or not. But now we see that it's actually happened.
Well, what's been disturbing to me is the fact that the administration had directed its congressional supporters to cut the Army Corps of Engineers budget by $70 million for the New Orleans district this year, and also had tabled plans for analyzing the levee system to find out how to protect the city from a Category 5 hurricane. I'm wondering what the thinking behind that would have been, given the situation that so many scientists were warning about.
Well, it's kind of a gamble. The city is well protected against a Category 3 hurricane, and the likelihood of any place along the coast, New Orleans in particular, being hit by a much stronger hurricane, Category 4 or 5, had been estimated at between 1% and maybe 4% for each individual year. And so the gamble was that that's not very likely to happen, and so that it would be better to take those financial resources and put them somewhere else in the administration's thinking.
Now, tell us exactly what did happen, because we understood that the storm surge might overwhelm the levees, but something else happened. The levees actually, a couple of them collapsed. Was that an expected outcome in this situation?
Not really. It's a complicated situation. The storm actually veered off a little bit to the east of New Orleans, so New Orleans was spared the worst part of the storm, including the storm surge. The storm surge to the east, to the east of the eye, was 25 or 30 feet tall, with very large waves, perhaps even 25 feet on top of that. But to the west of the eye wall, the storm surge was much lower, 15 feet or lower, which was lower than the levees on the side of Lake Pontchartrain and the Mississippi River. So the storm surge didn't actually breach the levees, but after the storm passed, the winds and the continued high water and the battering of the levees caused a couple segments of them to collapse after the main part of the storm left. And being that most of the city of New Orleans sits between 2 and 10 feet below sea level and below the level of Lake Pontchartrain, the water just poured in until the levels of the water in the city were equal to the levels of the water in the lake.
Now, you wrote in your book about a hurricane powerful enough to add flooding to areas upriver of New Orleans, that would also be a grave danger. And did that contribute to this? In other words, the water, the Mississippi also flooded, didn't it? Or am I wrong?
Yes, the Mississippi is flooding, but the event that you're talking about did not happen, luckily, during this particular storm. What I wrote about in the book is that if we get a very powerful hurricane that causes flooding rains on the Mississippi, perhaps at a time when the Mississippi is already at bank full capacity, if you go upstream from Baton Rouge, there's a junction between the Mississippi River and a river called the Atchafalaya River near the Mississippi-Louisiana border. And if the Mississippi were to change course and flow down the Atchafalaya, it would find a much shorter route to the Gulf of Mexico, which is what the natural tendencies of the river would be to find the shortest route to the ocean to transport all those sediments to the sea. If that happened, then the whole active delta region would subside below sea level, including the area around New Orleans. And
in other words, go ahead.
Go on. This is all part of a natural cycle for the evolution of the Mississippi and other deltas worldwide. The way the deltas work is that they deposit a lobe that is typically active in the Mississippi example for 500 to 1,000 years, and then some kind of event like a storm comes along and changes the course of the river, and the course switches to a shorter route to the sea, depositing a new delta, and then the old lobe subsides below sea level and becomes uninhabitable. And right now the Mississippi would like for that to happen for the active lobe of the delta.
The Atchafalaya River. When I was a kid, we used to call it the Chowfalau, and I courted my first girlfriend on a canoe along that river.
That's wonderful.
A long time ago. Anyway, how this could happen? In other words, it hasn't happened in thousands of years, but is it more or less likely to happen as time passes?
It's probably more likely to happen as time passes. If we look at the history of the changing of the lobes of the Mississippi River, we've had about 16 new lobes in the past 6,000 or 7,000 years, and maybe 6 or 7 major changes like the one I'm talking about here, which happen every 500 to 1,000 years. And the current lobe has been active for between 600 and 1,000 years, so we're about ready statistically for this to switch. And the river at the junction is ready for it to switch as well. That's why the Army Corps of Engineers has been very active up there in building dam systems and levee systems to try to prevent this. And so it's essential that they keep their funding to prevent this other potential catastrophe from happening.
Well, hopefully their funding won't be cut. I'm sure the Senate is going to restore the $70 million cut and more for New Orleans now. But unfortunately, I think there was... in today's Wall Street Journal, they're talking about a lack of proper planning on the federal level. And I do know that the governor of Louisiana had been writing letters to the president about this problem for some time, especially since last year all of those hurricanes hit Florida at once, and there are meteorologists, very prominent ones, were predicting that this year would be a very severe year for hurricanes, as indeed it has proved to be the case. And yet still there was no reaction. Nobody seemed to care. What do we need to do, if anything, politically, to recognize that perhaps the odds are really more against us now than with us, given what we're seeing on the ground in terms of storms?
Well, people get to be a little bit complacent with storms because we've seen a few of them get close to New Orleans, using this as an example, and then veer off to the east, or they lose their intensity, and then people say, oh, I weathered it through a Category 3 hurricane, so I'm going to sit here for the next storm. And the same thing happens, I think, with the decision makers in Washington, who say that it's so unlikely that this event will happen, and we know that we need the money right now for this other program, whether it be for Homeland Security or for the war in Iraq or whatever it may be. There's very tough decisions that have to be made. It's a tough call. If you can say that we need better armor to protect the troops in Iraq, or do we need better higher seawalls around New Orleans, it's hard to predict the future. So it's very difficult.
I believe there's a story in the Times-Picayune today on their online edition to the effect that money that was earmarked for protecting and building up the levees around New Orleans was instead used in Iraq. Literally a quid pro quo, apparently. And
apparently, yeah.
Yeah, and that is that's unfortunate, and it represents some very poor policy planning on the part of administration. I mean, they talk about protecting us. It seems like they've protected us from the wrong enemy here, but that's another conversation.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit go back up to Baton Rouge and the Army Corps of Engineers work that they're doing to try to maintain the current course of the Mississippi. How likely are they to succeed in that? Is that a doable thing?
Well, they've managed to do it for a couple of decades so far. So as long as they keep funding the Corps of Engineers in that particular area, and if we know what the consequences are if they don't, then I think the administration will be convinced enough to say that it's a very important issue. We don't want to lose this huge area to subsidence below sea level. Right now, we're losing a tremendous amount of land from the Mississippi Delta that's just subsiding below sea level. We're losing an area that's about 30 square miles per year, which is about the equivalent of something the size of Manhattan that's subsiding below sea level. And ironically, one of the big reasons why we're losing so much land surface is because of the levees. The levees were built starting in the late 1800s to protect the people from the floods coming down the Mississippi. Mississippi has had very major floods in 1883, 1892, 1903, 1909, and 1927. 1927 was a very catastrophic flood. About 1,000 people were killed and 50,000 left homeless, and in the same area we're talking about now. And then again, people are more familiar with the 1973 and 1993 floods. So these levees are very effective at keeping the water from overflowing the banks of the Mississippi, but they do something else that's a little bit more sinister, in that they take the sediment, the mud and the silt that the river transports from upstream, and instead of depositing it on the delta and on the floodplains of the river, it takes that same sediment and deposits it off in the deep Gulf of Mexico. And we need those sediments on the floodplain and on the delta to replenish the land and to keep it from subsiding below sea level. And so the very reason that the land is subsiding is the reason that we're protecting the people from the floods. And so by protecting ourselves from this one threat from floods, we've made ourselves more vulnerable to the threat from the ocean for the hurricanes. So it's a very ironic situation.
Yeah, I should say, because we're certainly seeing the consequences of it now with this. Now, the other areas that were hit besides New Orleans, they weren't affected by this particular system, by this particular process. Biloxi and so forth. It was just a straight unlucky hit by a hurricane, wasn't it, or was it?
Yeah, that's a little different. I mean, the big problem in New Orleans is that the city is below sea level and surrounded by these levees, and the water went over the top of the levees, and the levees collapsed. and now we have a bathtub situation of a bunch of very polluted and toxic water filling up the city. But in Biloxi and other places in Mississippi, that was a more classic hurricane situation where they were to the east of the eye of the hurricane, a very powerful hurricane that had a storm surge estimated to be up to 30 feet tall in some places.
Yeah.
That came up and it came in with incredible force, and on top of that, there's 140 mile an hour winds and perhaps 25-foot tall waves on top of the storm surge. So you put all those things together, and there aren't very many structures that can withstand that.
No. We're going to be right back. This is Whitley Strieber. It's Dreamland. This is Whitley Strieber. It's Dreamland. We're talking to Timothy Kuski, St. Louis University professor. St. Louis University is located in, I would guess, St. Louis, and he is and also the author of a number of other books, including the Encyclopedia of Earth Sciences and Marine Geology, Exploring the New Frontiers of the Ocean. And I'm going to try to get, before we are finished, to some work you've done on ancient rocks in China that may change the evolutionary timeline and what all of that means. But right now, I think we should continue to concentrate on New Orleans. And let me ask you this. What are the consequences of what's happening now and the likelihood that it will be possible to fix it by shoring up the levees and pumping out the water? Are we going to see a situation with more fundamental change than they're looking at right now?
It's not going to be a pretty picture when the water is taking out of the city of New Orleans. It's going to be a long time before the water gets out of there because although New Orleans has one of the largest urban pumping systems in the world, all of those pumps are underwater right now and they're not functioning. And so we need to get new pumps in there, and it's going to take many, many weeks, perhaps even 2 or 3 months by some estimates, to get the city to dry out once the levees are fixed. And anything that's been underwater in this mixture of water and petrochemicals and sewage and all the animals that are corpses that are in there as well, there aren't very many structures that can survive being underwater for that long. So we're going to have a lot of buildings that need to be demolished. A lot of the land is going to be contaminated by all this toxic waste that's in there. And so there's going to be an enormous expense going into the cleanup effort around on New Orleans. And so one of the decisions that is going to have to be made for this area is, do we need to rebuild the city and people's homes in this place that's subsiding below sea level? With the current rate of subsidence on the Mississippi Delta and around New Orleans, it's estimated that the city itself will be on the Gulf of Mexico shore by the year 2090. So we have about 85 years left before the city is a depression that's sitting 10 feet below sea level, surrounded by a system of high levees and dikes, sitting right on the shore, being even more vulnerable to powerful storms like this. And so the people who are deciding whether or not we need to rebuild the city here need to evaluate the cost and the long-term plans about whether this is the best place to rebuild or whether we should actually consider moving the city maybe to the other side of Lake Pontchartrain even. It's a tremendous decision, but it needs to be discussed at this stage.
What is your thought? What do you think should be done?
I think we need to evaluate the costs of perhaps moving a large part of the residential areas and perhaps the industry to a more stable location. Because the alternative is to start to replenish the wetlands. There's a program going on right now of trying to restore the wetlands to the natural state, but that's going to take decades. And it's hard to counteract the natural subsidence of an area the size of the Mississippi Delta. It takes millions and billions of dollars to pump new soil up there. The levee system is continuing to bring the muds and the silts out far to the Gulf of Mexico. So it's an enormously expensive prospect, and it's only getting more and more expensive to protect the city as time goes on.
So it reaches a point where the cost of protecting the city is far greater than the value of the city where it is now, is what you're saying.
Yeah, and with such an enormous rebuilding effort that's going to have to be undertaken in a few months, we need to consider whether this is the time to move significant parts of the city to a different place. This is the tragedy that could be used to protect the area and the future and the people.
One wonders, the founder of the city was a Frenchman whose name, I must admit, escapes me at the moment, who made a choice, even that back then was controversial, to place the city where he placed it. And one wonders why he would do that.
Well, there's a long history of settlements on the south shore of Lake Pontchartrain from the Indians before New Orleans was established by the French in about 1718, I think it was. And the reason that they picked this area was it had easy access to Lake Pontchartrain. It was a nice area for trading. It was sheltered from the Gulf of Mexico. So it was a good place at that stage, and it wasn't below sea level at that stage either. A lot of the subsidence has happened in more recent times. It's been subsiding at a rate of a couple millimeters to a couple centimeters per year. And a lot of that is from the effect that I described before, because we're not replenishing the surface of the land from the overbank deposits from the Mississippi, from the silt and the mud during the floods. But also, when we were pumping oil and petroleum out from underneath the city and underneath Lake Pontchartrain, when you take fluids out from underneath the surface subsides. And it wasn't until recently that was stopped in I think the 1992 was when 1992 was when drilling was stopped around Lake Pontchartrain. And so the subsidence has slowed down, but already you can't pump up the land an extra 2 or 10 feet. So that land has subsided forever, and the rest of the land around there is still subsiding, but at a lower rate. And so it's a very difficult situation. And it wasn't so bad in the early 1700s.
Now I want to change topics right now because I'm fascinated with this work in China that you've done. And could you tell us a little bit about what you did and what your findings are?
Yeah, that's a very different subject.
Yeah, very different subject, but this is a very eclectic program, and okay. I know my listeners will be fascinated to hear this.
Okay, part of this work is related to trying to understand the very, very early history of the Earth and how the Earth changed from when it first formed about 4.5 billion years ago to the present state it's in right now. And right now, we have plate tectonics operating on the Earth where new oceanic crust is created at mid-ocean ridges, that magma upwells there, cools by interacting with the seawater, moves away from the ridges, and eventually sinks back into the mantle at places we call subduction zones where two plates are converging. And we know this process has been going on for at least 1 billion years, and there's been a lot of controversy and discussion in scientific circles about how far back in time that process goes, and did the Earth cool itself by that process or by some other process in the early history of the Earth. And in my work in China, we found a piece of this oceanic crust and lithosphere that's 2.5 billion years old, and it is so distinctive in terms of having the structure that we recognize as forming only at mid-ocean ridges that we can say that we had seafloor spreading going on 2.5 billion years ago. And this is the oldest piece of complete oceanic crust and lithosphere that we know of in the planet. So it demonstrates that this plate tectonic process was going on 2.5 billion years ago. And more recently, we've been doing work on some of the sedimentary rocks that were deposited on top of that piece of oceanic crust. And we found evidence for what we call black smoker chimneys, which are seafloor hydrothermal vents where hot fluids come out of the oceanic crust. And there's a very unique community of fauna and flora, of animals and plants that live around these communities. And we found very similar fossils around this 2.5 billion year old piece of oceanic crust, suggesting that we had early life on the Earth 2.5 billion years ago sitting on the deep ocean floor. So it's a very fascinating area.
Oh,
and
yeah.
I'm going back there. I'm going back on Sunday to do some more work on that.
Going back to China?
Yes.
Oh, let me ask you, how do you know that it's 2.5 billion years old?
We've dated the rocks and the minerals in the rocks by 4 different methods, by using radioactive decay schemes. Different isotopes decay to different daughter products, and we've used 4 independent methods, and they all get the same age.
It's amazing how old our planet really is. It's almost unimaginable that in the scale of this, the age of the dinosaurs is just a minute away. In
right.
effect.
Yeah. That's right.
And here we are worrying about our little lives that last 50 or 70 years, so short a time in the scale of geologic time that it's almost would be undetectable, and yet it's what we have. What do you think is likely to come out in terms of policy? I'm going to return to New Orleans now, just before we have just a couple of minutes left. In terms of this, do you think that the likelihood is that they will try to rebuild the city, or that there is going to be a serious proposal to move it?
I think, in all likelihood, the city will be rebuilt where it is, because it's very difficult to convince people to move from their homes. People have lived there for a couple of hundred years now. They have a long history. It's actually quite a nice place when it's not raining, when there's not a hurricane. But there'll be some discussion about moving it, and I think those will be voices that are in the minority. It will be a more expensive proposition to move the city now than to rebuild it, but in the end it would be cheaper, because we still have that 1 to 4% chance that another hurricane of this force will happen any particular year. So we might rebuild the city, and we'll see another hurricane come along in a couple of years, and the same thing can happen again. And it might be a direct hit the next time.
That is a sobering thought indeed. Tim, Dr. Kuski, it's been a pleasure to have you with us. He teaches at St. Louis University. Images of floating corpses being eaten by alligators in that city. Apparently it is maybe even worse than they're saying. And here in this country, just as if after 9/11, our media did not show people jumping out of the World Trade Center in droves, which they did do. So we are being maybe kind of the truth is being held back. They're saying abroad New Orleans may be a dead city. And that may be true. Now listen, as Scott talks about whether or not this is something that was done. Now, do I believe this? My job on Dreamland is not to endorse my guests at all, but rather to let them talk in ways that they really can't talk on other radio programs, because everybody else goes in with some kind of an agenda, some sort of agenda. I have no agenda. My agenda is I want him to tell you what he thinks, and that's exactly what I do, and you'll find this interview, quite frankly, I'm sure, just like I found it, absolutely riveting. Then after that, we're going to go to a professor of geology from St. Louis University. We're going to spend 2 segments with him. This is a man who predicted this happening 3 years in 2003. He predicted it. He is a very, very well-established geologist, and he lays it out more clearly than you have ever heard anywhere else, what did happen, what must be done, and what the consequences might be, what we can look at down the road for this. So this is Dreamland at its, in my opinion, absolute best. I was absolutely glued to my chair by both of these guys. So before we go on, I'm just going to ask you to stop and think a minute about where this comes from. It comes out of your pocket. You have to pay for it. Subscribe, because we are running scared here now. We need you. And I've added a little inducement. If you subscribe for a year now, the first 25 people who do so between now and Sunday midnight,
great distance, like you're just sitting next to it. So you could melt metal, you could shoot down planes, you could crush subs, you could do amazing things without ever having to fire a bullet. And one of the aspects of this technology was the ability to turn back the gain on these antennas and influence the weather, influence the electrical processes, which are still not acknowledged within the scientific or the atmospheric sciences. I mean, they really don't understand how lightning works. Well, this gives us the answers as to how the atmosphere works, and that the electrical process is a massive portion of the equation that our guys still don't get. And in this way, they can covertly use weather as a weapon.
What about earthquakes?
Easy to do. Easy to do.
Okay,
You focus.
now let me stop you right there, okay?
Sure.
Because something is happening right now as we are talking. We are talking a little bit before the program goes online. It is the 1st of September. It is approximately 11:10 Pacific time, and in the past few hours, over the 31st of August and the 1st of September, there have been 7 earthquakes in Southern California with a magnitude of 4 or greater. And I'm asking you now, could this, and we're going to get into Katrina in a minute, this is something that is being done by somebody. Could it be that their next step is a big Southern California earthquake, Scott?
That's my full expectation, is that we'll have 2 events, 2 cities will have some level of damage that will tie them together temporally, time-wise, because of Katrina, 29, 30 August, and then whatever is next to happen. There's an interesting website that I subscribe to. It's called halfpasthuman.com, and they send bots out to scour the web, and their technology is alpha, asymmetric.
Obviously, it's a very, very, very bad situation, and Dreamland is responding to it on 2 different levels. First, we're going to go way out on the edge with Scott Stevens of weatherwars.info, and throughout the program, I say weatherwars.org. It's not weatherwars.org. The correct is weatherwars.info. You'll want to look at his website as you listen, I'm sure. His thesis is that there is a war going on and that the weather is the weapon. Not only that we are behind, the United States is well behind whoever is attacking us with the weather and with earthquakes. And as I speak, there have been a cluster of 4-point-plus earthquakes in Southern California, which is very unusual and suggests that there may indeed be another earthquake here. You'll be interested to see how he reacts to that. Dreamland also, as you know, we have a subscriber end of it, and in the subscriber section this week, I'm talking about what, in my opinion, is probably one of the most important things I've ever done. It's a conversation or a discussion about group meditation and the power of group meditation, how it works, what it is, and how to do it, because we need to start doing that. We can make a lot of change with this. It's not any kind of pie in the sky. It does work, and let me tell you how. So do subscribe. We have had in the past week a tremendous drop-off in subscriptions for this website because people are riveted to their televisions by what's happening to Hurricane Katrina. However, the truth is, this is probably one of the most relevant and important places, this website and unknowncountry.com. If you follow the news on unknowncountry.com and you take our free newsletter, you are getting news that is literally not available anywhere else. For example, we talk about coming gas shortages in the Southeast and Midwest and how to prepare for them. You don't hear that anywhere. We talk about, is the situation in New Orleans even much worse than we're being told in the United States? Because you may not know this, but foreign media sources are showing horrendous.
Tulsa, and then eventually out here to Idaho. What got me interested in this topic was the inability to get more accurate forecasts as the computer models and as our experience would have deemed or we would have seen necessary. We would have gotten better as time went on. But as I kind of would go back through and do verification of forecasts, the accuracy slipped from, say, at 5 days out, 4 degrees or 3 degrees error to about 4 degrees. And I'm like, well, what am I doing wrong? What am I missing that I can't get these forecasts correct? And that led to this area of manipulation and the research of a Lieutenant Colonel Tom Bearden and his essays and his intelligence going back to a Soviet weapons program titled Energetics that was developed by Stalin and had incredible resources devoted to it. And in fact, while we were developing the atomic bomb with the Manhattan Project, Stalin matched us bomb for bomb, as we all know. But he also commandeered his best scientists and said, get me a secret weapon. Get me something that these Americans don't have. And they brought boatloads of documents from universities and from science and from publications and scoured them, not in a peer review process where you pat each other on the back for work done, but to tear them to pieces, looking for errors, looking for bad assumptions, and so forth. And they found them. They found them in the laws of thermodynamics. They found them in the laws of conservation of energy. They found them in basically classical physics and relativity. And they fixed them. And this makes quantum physics with classical physics with a unified theory. And it is from this in physics that they developed their energetics program, which resulted in a new kind of electromagnetic wave. Not the Hertzian waves that we send along, telephone signals and television signals and so forth, but longitudinal waves, which is far more like sound. And then use of these waves can affect a target.
Get a free copy of the 911 in Plain Sight Director's Cut DVD. It's the best offer I've ever had on this radio program, because basically if we don't get the cash, we got to cut back, and this is not the time for that. No sirree, Bob. So do yourself something you've been needing to do for a while. Right now, while you're listening, click on that subscribe tab on the unknowncountry.com website. You can see it just to the right of the media player. Click on it now while you listen. And if you already are a subscriber, thank you, thank you, thank you. We are alive because of you, and we are almost alone in this world in reporting the news as we do in ways you simply cannot get it elsewhere. We have with us Scott Stevens of weatherwars.info. Weatherwars.info is a website devoted to a very unusual aspect of weather observation. Scott is involved in the weather modification issue, and we're going to begin by asking, if I may, Scott, how you became involved in this, and what exactly are your credentials for being an expert on weather modification and weather wars?
Yeah. Weather has been an interest of mine for quite some time. Between astronomy and weather, it was kind of a debate as I went through junior high and high school as to which path I would eventually take. I really wanted to be an astronaut, but then that was growing up during the Apollo days when we did exciting things in space. But I ended up in weather partially because of the Scouting Merit Badge, and that interest introduced me to the topic, and I just found it fascinating. I enjoyed the numbers, I enjoyed the observations, and so forth. So that kind of led me on this path to, and the first job I took was a senior in high school, working at a local TV station here in Idaho. And from then, off to the University of Kansas to study meteorology, and then working at several affiliates across the country, from Topeka to Omaha to Albany, New York,